And thank you for joining us for today's webinar, A Decade of Change, Lightweighting, the Key to Compliance, presented by IHS Automotive. IHS Automotive is a leading source of information and insight to critical areas that shape the automotive aftermarket. With that in mind, the Auto Care Association has partnered with IHS Automotive to bring you a series of industry analysis webinars to enhance the association's role in providing timely, authoritative research. Today's webinar is presented by Michael Robinette, IHS Automotive's Managing Director, Global Advisory Practice. Today he will discuss the solutions OEMs and suppliers are implementing for increased vehicle efficiency, reduced mass, increased aerodynamics, and use of lighter materials and electrification to comply with emission standards. These solutions will drive substantial changes in the aftermarket. At the end of the presentation, he will be fielding questions, so be sure to submit your questions using the chat feature in your control panel. Thank you again for joining, and with that, I will turn it over to Michael.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everybody who's listening in this afternoon. We appreciate your time, and thank you to the Auto Care Association for the opportunity to speak to you today. As was mentioned, we're going to take you through a discussion of not only where lightweighting is going, but also what some of the building blocks as to why we have to lightweight within the automotive industry. Just a quick note about IHS, and IHS continues to evolve with the industry over time, and we take it from the essentially the beginning of the process with product planning all the way through to production and marketing into customers and sales, and then certainly as was appropriate for this audience, into the aftermarket. So IHS, it takes it through the full line of where automotive is touching the industry, but also touching the consumer and the greater environment. So again, we thank you for the opportunity and that you're listening in today. So to get into it, I'm going to spend a couple minutes and sort of set the stage. What is the market looking like right now? There's obviously a lot of issues. We've got the Brexit issues, but also even before Brexit, there was some issues in North America where sales were starting to plateau somewhat, and there's been a lot of mixed changes within the industry in terms of more crossover utilities, fewer percentages of sedans and hatchbacks. So certainly we'll talk about how that's impacting the industry. We also think it's really important to understand the structural changes that are going to be impacting the industry over the next decade, and there are many of them. We'll attack the top 5 or 6, but nonetheless there are several major impacts that are going to affect not only the suppliers, but also in the aftermarket, retailers, distribution, all the way through the entire chain. And then as we finish up, we'll talk about what will happen with respect to lightweighting and some of those material shifts. So BIW is an acronym for body in white. So body in white is essentially whatever gets sent through a paint shop at a vehicle production facility. So again, that's a bit of an acronym in the automotive industry. We're going to be talking about those material shifts. So let's get into it. First and foremost is the crude oil price, and as you probably know already, IHS is very well integrated into the global market from a forecast perspective with respect to oil prices. And the true factor that's important here is the fact that we're really not expecting $100 oil, especially in constant dollars, not until the end of the decade and probably well after. So what's going to be critical is the fact that while we've got emissions and regulatory standards that are becoming increasingly more difficult to meet over time, oil prices will rise, but certainly not to the levels that we've seen in the past and as quickly as many had expected. So oil is going to be sort of this constant clash of emissions with the low price of oil, at least within the United States, and that'll be an important building block going forward. What's also important is what industry what are the OEMs facing from an industry perspective? So you see 4 regions here, a region that we affectionately call JK or Japan, Korea, North America, which in our parlance is US, Canada, and Mexico, Oceania, which is essentially Australia and New Zealand, and then Western Europe, which is self-explanatory. I think what's important here is that most of these markets are stable, if not only slightly declining over time. So we're really not expecting much action here. It's going to be more of a mixed change in terms of these markets. Different OEMs selling different types of vehicles with different technologies and different content levels, and that's where the opportunities are going to lie. What the OEMs are looking at, though, is how do they expand in some of those emerging markets. So, for instance, this is a global view of what's going on with respect to vehicle production from the middle of last decade to the end of our current forecast horizon, 2022 or 2023. And you can see here that we grew very, very quickly over the last 5 or 6 years, almost an unprecedented 7% per year from a global perspective. And we stomached a lot of new production, new capacity, and also a lot of structural change in the industry. If you look forward to the next 5 years after that, our growth rate's going to slow. It's going to slow by actually more than half, down to about 3%. And then you move after that, and you have about 2% decline, or 2% increase, which is going to be a decline in the growth rate from before. So mix is going to be important going forward. And you may say, why is it important to understand the global market? Well, it's important to understand the global market because the OEMs are investing in different areas. You've got investments in China, investments in India, investments in Thailand, and different markets to take advantage of growing consumer bases, which means that they may not paying quite as much attention to the developed markets. And also their purview is changing as well as the center of mass within those companies. So it is very important to understand that the world continues to grow. It just may not be growing around us, it's growing in other markets especially. So that being said, when we start to look at where the market is going overall, it's important to understand what's going on with respect to the size of vehicles. And as we affectionately say to a lot of our clients, the world is growing smaller. It's growing smaller from a perspective of A and B segment vehicles. A segment vehicles are essentially holding their own at about 5% of the market, but B segment, and this would be a vehicle as small as a Ford Fiesta or a Toyota Yaris, or even a crossover utility like an HR-V from Honda. Those are all off B segment platforms. You can see that they are growing over time. Why? Because you have growth in markets like a Brazil, markets like in India. At some point you'll have growth certainly in China and Thailand and other markets where B and C segment vehicles are very important. So this is where most of the OEMs, at least the mass market OEMs, are spending the bulk of their time, is in B segment and C segment to make sure that they've got leading edge global platforms, the highest scale possible, and interestingly enough, this is where a lot of their newer consumers are going to be looking at their vehicles. From a body style perspective or body type perspective, you can see that SUV has more than doubled globally. It went from 12% of total output in 2002, and you fast forward 2 decades, and as I mentioned, it's close to 30% of the market. Think of the dynamics now that your average crossover utility or sport utility structure is on average about 200 to 300 pounds heavier. It's sometimes a little bit more than your average sedan off the same platform. So again, we're challenging ourselves somewhat from a perspective of we've got these new emission standards to meet, but yet our vehicles are getting heavier on the same footprint. So this is a little bit of a challenge going forward. You can see there's a lot of change going on with respect to body type. So let's spend a minute and take a look at what's going on within our own U.S. forecast. And I think what's critical here is the fact that we're still looking for a fairly robust market this year. We've had a couple of tepid months, but the building blocks of the market are still relatively strong. with low interest rates and also with still very strong affordability and decent selection for customers. So it's our expectation that the market's still going to grow modestly over the next couple years. Where we see some concern is as interest rates start to rise, as we get towards the end of this cycle. We're in the 7th year of a cycle, and that's fairly long into a cycle. As we go into the future, we see some affordability issues. Affordability mainly from the customer perspective, but rising costs that are going to be baked into the vehicle in the next 5 or 6 years, and we'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides. If you take a look at what's going on in the market, and again, we're going to look at North American production for a minute to give us a different perspective. U.S., Canada, Mexico. What's critical is you might say, well, this is an aftermarket presentation. Why do I need to know about North American production? Well, what's interesting here is that still fully 80% of the vehicles built in North America stay here. So it is still very important to understand where the vehicles are coming from, what kind of technologies are being integrated into them, and how global they are from a platform perspective. The Detroit 3 are likely going to be less than 50% of production by the beginning of next decade. So that's definitely a change in terms of the fact that they used to be, at one point they were 95% in 1980. As you can see, in year 2000 they were more than 3/4, and then they're moving to half. So that change in the complexity of the number of parts and permutations that aftermarket distributors need to carry to service the market. So let's take a couple minutes to talk about some of the structural changes. I outlined some of the quick ones at the beginning, but if we'll get into a little bit more deeply, and you'll see that the level of change that's really going to be impacting the market. So if you take a look at this particular graphic, you can see, for instance, in 2015, from year 2000, there's been a fairly consistent convergence. And we get a lot of clients come to us and ask us the question of, why does the United States have to continue to reduce their emission standards? In other words, become more difficult, more difficult to attain those emission standards going forward. Well, what's interesting is you can see the rest of the world is moving in the same direction. The U.S. has had to catch up to an extent, but for the most part, the world is continuing to converge and reduce their emissions footprint from a vehicle perspective. If we were to maintain our emissions footprint at the same level, our vehicles at some point would not be able to be sold in other markets, number one. But number two, we would not be able to purchase vehicles from other parts of the world because they'd be just too different from a cost perspective than us. There are a lot of other reasons why this convergence is going on. Part of it is global scale. If we built vehicles just for us, we would lose the scale, the positive scale aspects of building a vehicle in France, in Japan, in China off of the same platform. So this gives you an idea of what's going on with respect to global emission standards and just how aggressive they are. This is another graphic, and this is actually from our friends at the EPA. What's interesting here is you can see that the emission standards, the dotted lines, in the future years are becoming more and more difficult to reach. Those lines are on average rising about 5% depending on the footprint of the vehicle. And as you rise 5%, if you really think about it, when you launch a brand new vehicle that sits in a market for maybe about 5 years before it's re-engineered, that means you literally need to improve the fuel economy on a brand new vehicle by about 20 to 25%, because improving the fuel economy in the middle of the cycle is very difficult. So increasingly a more difficult market from an emissions perspective and a fuel economy perspective. And so therefore the technology is definitely going to be a major differentiator in the future. This is a very quick graphic. Within IHS, we have several different tools at our disposal that we can utilize to better understand if a particular segment or manufacturer is going to have compliance issues in the future with respect to the trajectory of their current vehicles, but also the trajectory of the emission standards or the fuel economy standards. And what you're seeing here is that B and C segment vehicles, which we were talking about earlier, and that's the vast majority of the global market, they're somewhat smaller in the North American market, are going to have some challenges complying, but not tremendous challenges. They're about 90 to 95% compliant out to 2021. The biggest issues are going to be in what we call D and E segment vehicles. The larger vehicles have the larger problems. They have the larger gaps to converge, but yet those larger vehicles have certain capability sets that are required by their customers, whether it be towing for a pickup truck or the ability to seat 5 to 7 people in a crossover utility. So you start to add up all these capabilities, and it's difficult just to shrink vehicles. You need to find new ways to lighten them, but also add more efficient powertrains and other capabilities to improve efficiency. So what's also interesting is that, and this has really come to light over the last, essentially the last couple of months, especially since the beginning of the year, where we heard that GM was purchasing Lyft and moving into the market with Maven, and then Ford with their mobility solutions, and we've heard of what Toyota is doing with Uber, and so there's a number of new affiliations. So what's interesting is that what's driving a lot of this? Well, there's 3 swim lanes. We call them swim lanes in terms of 3 mutually exclusive, but in the end, very integrated impacts on the market. So you've got electrification as you move from start-stop to mild hybrid to full hybrid to battery electric vehicles. You integrate into that 48-volt capability, which will have a tremendous impact, by the way, on the aftermarket and their solutions that they bring to customers. Then you move on to the next swim lane in terms of automated driving, and that's really impacting almost all of us every day with blind spot detection, forward collision control, cross path detection, lane departure, and a number of other electronic technologies that really make our vehicles safer. And then lastly, this whole idea of shared mobility that I mentioned earlier with Maven, with Uber, with Lyft, and a number of other services that are out there. Volkswagen now has joined on with one in Europe. So you add all these up together, you might say, well, what brings these 3 in common? But if you think about a decade from now, electrification will be very important with automated driving and then also with shared mobility. They all work together at some point in time. So these are 3 very, very important trends that the supply base and the OEMs, as well as the distribution network, needs to understand. Okay, and then we talked very quickly at the beginning about some pricing issues, but if you start to add up some of the things that we've just been talking about, so you add in the fact that the market is starting to plateau a little bit, and that mix is going to be more important and content will be more important. So certainly the vehicle manufacturers have used the last couple of years of reducing commodity prices to be able to essentially bake more content into their vehicles and also raise the price at the same time. Your average price of your price of the average vehicle has gone up over $5,000. It resides somewhere between $33,000 and $34,000 per vehicle. So that seems like a very high number, but it moved from 28 or 29 over the last 5 or 6 years. So the customers being able to absorb a lot of that new pricing and content because we have low interest rates and a fairly robust or increasingly robust economy. If those commodity prices come back, so therefore the vehicle manufacturers and the suppliers have to pay more to build the vehicles and the components. We've got more electronic content in the form of ADAS, automated driving and the like. You've also got lightweighting, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, and that adds cost to the equation. You add in any of the other factors like higher interest rates and the like. So you start to see the vehicle pricing, vehicle costs could go up, and therefore that's going to be a bit of a break on certainly the heady volumes that we've seen over the last couple of years. So a little bit of a warning sign, but something that everybody should be very, very aware of. Okay, so now hopefully we've been able to set the stage somewhat. We've given you some idea of where the volumes are and what the building blocks of what's driving the market. We've talked about some structural changes with respect to the three different swim lanes of automated driving and electrification and shared mobility, and also some of those other knock-on effects. And then now let's talk about what's going on with respect to lightweighting. And we, just 1 minute on the genesis of this forecast, we had a client come to us a couple years ago and want to better understand where they could locate a stamping facility in the U.S. South. So we actually built a forecast by plant so we could show them where the highest percentage of aluminum was going to be, or highest percentage of ultralight strength steel, so they could better locate their facility and have a leg up on their competition. And that really started the ball rolling with IHS working through and building a body and weight material forecast. So let's get into how we put that together. This is your average, what we call body in white. A full body in white actually has all the closures on it. So it has the fenders, the hood, the doors, the roof, as well as the deck lid or the lift gate are all part of the final assembly. But this gives you an idea of sort of the skeleton of today's vehicle. And the different colored components give you an idea of the different yield strengths of steel or sometimes aluminum that are used within the vehicle. So just not one particular material masters the entire skeleton. They use different materials with different joining methods to really bring today's vehicle to life. So you can see that we break out a number of different areas such as hood and deck lid, closures which are doors, and also an interesting one that has been moving very quickly to new materials is shock towers, or the mounts for the shock absorber are really moving very, very quickly. So with that, let's take a look at what the entire market looks like from a mass perspective. And we're going to be looking at production here. Interestingly enough, we've actually quoted the same type of forecast but on a sales basis for a vehicle manufacturer. So that's an interesting twist to this. But this is in billions of pounds. How heavy the body in white is, and this is the first swipe that we're looking at here is the different steels. And you can see the darker blue is mild steel, which is sort of the thickest and the least technical steel, if you want to think about it that way. And then you kind of work your way up to ultra high strength and what we call gigapascal steel, which is in some cases also hot stamped. So it goes through a process where it's heated up to 900 Fahrenheit, put into a press, and then quenched with water to maintain its shape, and it becomes very, very hard at that point. So the more expensive steels are certainly the gigapascal and the advanced high strength steels, and that's, as you can see, that we've got less and less blue, darker blue, and more lighter blue over time. That's certainly the movement over time. Then you add in aluminum, and there's been a lot of discussion about aluminum. We've broken it out here between sheet and cast and extrusions. So certainly aluminum sheet is exactly what the term describes. It's basically coiled sheet that is cut in sections and then put into a press where you'll make the outers for doors or fenders, or a lot of hoods are made out of aluminum. And increasingly we're finding more and more parts of the vehicle are moving towards aluminum sheet. But to back that up, you need aluminum extrusions and castings to sort of support that aluminum. And we were talking earlier about shock towers. More and more shock towers are being made out of aluminum cast. It's a perfect solution for what used to be a very, very heavy component within the vehicle. And then interestingly enough, you add in the fact that there's going to be some CFRP, carbon fiber reinforced plastic, or SMC, sheet molded composite. That is rising over time. especially in very weight-sensitive applications like, certainly sports cars, and also increasingly pickup trucks in terms of beds. They're looking at CFRP and SMC as a solution as well. So it gives you a good idea of how the world or how the North American market is growing from a mass perspective. And again, behind that there's many stories. Let's see if we can go a little bit deeper and talk about what's going on in the market. From a total mass perspective, you can see the average mass is actually declining over time, and that would make complete sense. We expect the market to grow roughly about 10% in terms of total production over this time period, but the total mass per vehicle is declining. Now, what's keeping it up somewhat is the fact that there's going to be more crossover utilities, and on average, those vehicles are heavier. So again, there's some real interesting nuances here. This is where total mass is going. When you take a look at it by manufacturer, you can see that the biggest loser from a mass perspective will be Chrysler, FCA, mainly because their vehicles are probably not the lightest right now, and they would be the first one to admit that, but they'll have to go on some fairly severe diets to better meet those emission standards in combination with a lot of powertrain technology as well in the future. So here's an interesting one. This is looking at aluminum sheet and cast, and why we're showing you this is that you've seen it's grown from less than 500 million pounds from basically in the form of hoods and some fenders for the most part, and a couple of vehicles that were being utilized for doors, and then growing very quickly. And this is probably the most important trend that the aftermarket needs to understand, that by 2022 or 2023, we're going to have tremendous use of aluminum sheet, especially in doors. Many shock towers are going to move to aluminum cast. Deck lids, which are basically the hatch or the trunk, are going to move very quickly towards this. And interestingly enough, even we expect that fenders, which are moving very quickly to aluminum, could be substituted out of aluminum and possibly into some plastic composite, maybe a CFRP or some other type of material later on into the next decade. So it doesn't mean that aluminum will be the end-all and be-all. It will have certain applications that will be very good, but also other applications that will be more transitionary over time. Here's another example. We're taking a look at Asian pickup trucks, and interestingly enough, you see a lot more green here. That's because more and more pickup truck beds will be manufactured out of plastic, an SMC material, which is fairly rugged but much lighter than what we've seen in the past. And one of the factors that's holding back adding even more mass reduction into these vehicles is the fact that the processes to put in a strong structure underneath these plastic beds, that technology is still evolving over time. So as that continues to perfect and new plastics are brought about, that will also continue to lightweight the vehicle over time. So we moved along pretty quickly, but we want to leave some time for questions. And again, just a very quick summary, and you can read them as well as I can, but I think it's really important to understand that we are at a point where we've reached probably into the 7th or 8th year of this cycle. The market really started coming back around the late 2009 as we hit that low and started to come back right after that summer of 2009, and then 2010 started to climb from a SAR perspective. So we've been at this for roughly about 7 years, and as we noted earlier, we're expecting modest growth for the next 2 years. Again, with respect to the Brexit and the like, there's a lot of factors that are impacting the market, but the constructs are still well in hand, and so we have a very good feel for the market for the next couple of years. It's after that, with respect to what happens with additional costs that's being baked into the vehicle, whether it is in the powertrain with greater battery integration and or electric motor integration. Also, new powertrain technologies in the form of turbo and variable valve, as well as additionally the lightweighting that we just talked about. It's not cheap to move to aluminum or higher strength steels. There's more capital required for build process changes as well as the material themselves. So a lot of factors that are impacting the market, but it's impacting the OE side first. But trust me when I say at some point, and the aftermarket industry will start to feel it very quickly as we start to see more of these material changes, but also some of these structural changes in the market. So again, we think that the industry needs to look forward and really understand how these factors are going to impact their business and not be surprised by them when they do emerge. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I think certainly at this point we have time for any questions that may have been written into your chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We have a couple questions here. If you have any questions, please submit them now to your chat panel. First of all, can you touch on how lightweighting is going to impact the aftermarket industry in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so no, it's a great point because we always try to loop it around and give us a reason why we're talking to the aftermarket audience about something that's happening on the OE side and may not have an impact right away. But if you think about, for instance, with respect to collision and body repair, obviously that's been well documented, but it's becoming much more widespread. This is just not sort of a Audi A8 and Ford F-Series type of situation where, yes, we've got some aluminum panels that we need to deal with and better understand. Trust me when I say that there's more aluminum moving into the market, but interestingly enough, it's not just aluminum, it's more advanced high-strength steels. So they're fixing and repairing those is much different than the old world where we could take frame adjustment and make some modifications and straighten the frame. That's a little bit more difficult in the world of advanced high-strength steels and aluminum. So just from that perspective, we see a number of changes in the way that components are brought together. The folks that are really going to do well in this industry are those that are making adhesives and different fastening techniques, rivets and the like are all doing very, very well in this industry because they're inventing new ways to bring, let's say, different types of steel and aluminum together, or carbon fiber and aluminum, or even different types of steels that are much different in terms of their strength and their rigidity. And so interestingly enough, the whole perspective of the process of how the vehicle is built, some of the adhesives and fastening, as well as the materials themselves, are going to drive a lot of changes into the aftermarket, not only starting now, but it really has started, but it will really accelerate over the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up to that, what do you see lightweighting doing to non-OEM collision parts?
So that's interesting. You know, there's been some talk about can you substitute, let's say, an aluminum fender with a steel one? And what's interesting, if you talk to most OEMs, obviously the treatment of those different materials is very different. And so if you go, the OEM will obviously stay with the same material. If you go to non-OEM, it may still be the same material, or it may be different material. I think one aspect is very interesting, and again, the OEMs will likely take this material change and want to hold on to, unfortunately, as much of the aftermarket as they can going forward. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult for let's say a non-OEM, let's just call it a fender, to go out and to go get, if it's made out of aluminum or if it's made out of SMC, to sort of recreate that component. It'll be a bit more difficult because that institutional knowledge of knowing how steel bends and how it and how it folds under and how you get the right creases, that's a whole another level of education that's required when aluminum or when you're putting it into a die in an SMC or a CFRP type situation. So the material is different. It's a little bit more controlled, and certainly the OEMs will, like in our opinion anyways, take this as an opportunity to take a somewhat more control over the aftermarket where possible.
Okay, good. You had a dedicated slide to Asian pickup trucks. Why are only the Asian OEMs pursuing plastic pickup truck beds?
Right now they are, but trust me when I tell you that the Detroit 3 will be moving in that general direction. A lot of it has to do with cadence. So when, for instance, Toyota was redoing their pickup truck, it worked out for them that to move to a plastic bed for, let's say, a Tacoma. But trust me when I say other manufacturers like Ford, when they bring out a Ranger, or maybe GM when they redo a Canyon in Colorado, considering the use of a plastic bed will be very high on their list, very, very high. So we just looked at Asian pickup trucks to give you an idea, but trust me when I say there's a lot of activity in domestic pickup trucks right now as well.
Thank you. Just a few more questions. What are your thoughts on the outlook for stop-start on non-hybrids?
Very high. So, the vehicle manufacturers are going to use stop-start as a go-to technology that's easily integrated in today's infrastructure. So if you take a look at your average engine bay and then obviously the space for the transmission, you're able to integrate stop-start relatively easily. It's not a major challenge. So the bigger issue is how much cost you're baking into the vehicle by adding in that stop start. It could be anywhere between $200 to $400 per vehicle depending on the OEM, the system, et cetera, et cetera. You're also finding that we're in a global market. So stop-start will be integrated into the European vehicles more quickly because they're using that as a compliance method, but certainly on a global platform, now that it's already packaged into a European vehicle, selling that same vehicle in North America or in China, you'll find that stop-start is now more easily integrated here. What you are going to find, though, interestingly enough, is that stop-start will have sort of a longevity to it. It'll be very important probably into 2022, 2023, but at that point we're going to need some other solutions, including lightweighting, by the way, to be able to meet the emission standards that are currently in front of us. So again, what'll probably happen is more mild hybrid and full hybrid options will be required at that point to really take up the mantle of where stop-start has kind of left off.
Two more questions. What's your take on the latest GM commercials that pitch high-strength steel versus aluminum?
Yeah, I know our corporate folks are on the line, so I got to be careful on this one. But I think what's interesting is that the OEMs, it's a very competitive market. It really underscores the fact that pickup trucks are obviously a major part of the profitability for everybody who's involved in them, whether it be FCA, Ford, or GM, or even in the case of Toyota and Nissan, which are very active in pickup trucks as well. I guess in the end, certainly it doesn't really underscore the true use of the pickup truck. Not many people are going to do what that has done, but it does highlight some of the limitations of the material change. In the end, I think that those that are driving an F-150 like the drivability of that vehicle, and so there's going to be some positives of it, and there's going to be some compromises. I don't think of that as a major compromise, to be frank with you.
Thank you. One last question. Are aluminum bodies more likely to corrode compared to other materials?
Actually, less so. So it's interesting. We've got Well, if you back up maybe 15 or 20 years, we still had vehicles that were sort of rusting out in the market, but we really don't find that too much anymore. We don't have vehicles that are sort of, unless they're quite old, but we don't have some vehicles that are maybe 10 years old that are rusting out. What's usually driving them into scrappage is maybe the powertrain is not very efficient, or maybe it's gone past its useful life. Sometimes the efficiency of the vehicle is not what the customers are looking for, and there's better options on the market. Safety is another factor. Connectivity is another factor. So this whole idea of scrappage because of the bodies rusting out is really not occurring much right now. Your average aluminum body, if you just let it sort of sit there, it's going to last 2 decades easily before you have any real corrosion. And the corrosion that's actually occurring or may occur is more what we call galvanic corrosion. It's really the sort of 2 dissimilar metals being connected to one another. And that's why I mentioned earlier about the fact that the suppliers in the industry that are doing a great job with respect to adhesives and the separation, but also the fastening techniques, those are the ones that are really going to reduce or eliminate the galvanic corrosion, but still hold those vehicles together to the levels that we've expected over the last 2 to 3 decades.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael, for the thank you, Michael, for that excellent presentation, and thank you to the participants for all your questions and for attending today's webinar. The webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Auto Care Association website within the next week. The Auto Care Association website is www.autocare.org, and you'll find it under the menus What We Do, Professional Development, Education, Industry Analysis Webinar Series. Again, thank you for participating, and within the next few minutes you will be receiving a survey about today's excellent webinar. Again, thank you very much, everyone, particularly to you, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.